Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Thank you for making the time to join us on a very short notice for this pop-up briefing on the ongoing dispute within OPEC Plus and its effects on the oil markets. And since we're at the Arab Gulf States Institute, the effects of this dispute on the Saudi-Emirati relationship. We're happy to have with us today Ben Cahill, Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He focuses on geopolitical risk and the oil market, as well as the economics of oil-producing states. Ben was previously a director in Energy Intelligence's Research and Advisory Group, and led its country risk practice advising oil and gas companies on politics, economics, and political risk. He also wrote on corporate strategy and was the lead analyst for Saudi Aramco, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, among others. Kate Dourian is a non-resident fellow at AGSIW, a contributing editor at the Middle East Economic Survey, and a fellow at the Energy Institute. Previously, she was the regional manager for the Middle East and Gulf states at the World Energy Council, as well as the program officer for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Energy Agency. I should mention that both Ben and Kate have published insightful pieces analyzing the roots of this dispute. I will share the links to the two pieces with you in the chat function shortly. I think Hussein also has a piece coming out later today, so keep an eye out for it at agsw.org, our website. With that, I also want to introduce Hussein Ibish, Senior Resident Scholar at AGSIW. He is a weekly columnist for Bloomberg and The National, and is also a regular contributor to many US and Middle Eastern publications. Moderating the discussion today is AGSIW Executive Vice President, Ambassador William Roebuck. He most recently served as a Deputy Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS and as a Senior Advisor to the Special Representative for Syria Engagement. He served as the US Ambassador to Bahrain from 2015 to 2017. And with that, Ambassador Roebuck, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. And thank you to you and to Bushra for putting this together on such short notice. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our guest outside this time zone. I'm delighted that AGSIW can be here today and put together this event to discuss the OPEC Plus dispute, what provoked it, the backdrop, what led up to it, possible compromises, and implications for the broader bilateral relationship between Saudi Arabia and UAE. As Raymond mentioned, we have two of the top energy experts focused on the Gulf. Delighted, Ben and Kate, to have you with us here today. And we also have, of course, AGSIW's talented political expert, Hussein, a keen-sighted observer in the region. I want to jump in relatively quickly, keep my throat clearing at a minimum. So let's get started with this pop-up briefing. I'm going to start it initially by looking to you, Ben. If you would kick things off and address the question, why is the UAE doing this now? Speak to us a bit, if you could, about the plans that they have made for energy, the investments, their partnerships that they've set up in the past few years that have led them essentially to take this position in the OPEC Plus dispute late last week. Ben?
Great. Well, thank you, Ambassador Roebuck, and thanks to the Arab Gulf States Institute for inviting me to be with you today. I really appreciate it. I think the most important thing to start with is that the roots of this current dispute within OPEC, they run back several years, and I would trace a lot of the origins of this back to 2016. I think that was kind of a pivotal year for oil policy in the UAE. A number of things happened that year, but underlying it all was that was basically the time when Mohammed bin Zayed effectively assumed control over the oil portfolio in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi. Previously, his brother, the UAE ruler, was really in charge of the oil portfolio, both the oil and the money, ADNOC and ADIA. Mohammed bin Zayed was previously, the driving force behind Mubadala. He created it. That was the engine of economic diversification. But, the oil sector for many, many years had been run in a very conservative fashion. It was an oil industry that really depended on a small number of partnerships with trusted companies that had been there for decades in huge concessions that were long life concessions. ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and Total were the so-called Abu Dhabi Club. They were the partners in the biggest onshore concession, were important offshore partners too. There were a number of Japanese companies that operated smaller concessions, which were really quite important to the UAE from a geopolitical and market perspective. And that was kind of the way that the oil sector was run for a long time. Again, very risk averse, conservative, a complex system of joint ventures, which had been in place for decades. And I think when Mohammed bin Zayed assumed control over the oil sector, as his brother kind of went out of the picture and was not so involved in day-to-day management, he basically took a very fresh approach to how the oil sector should be managed. It was about breaking up those old concessions into smaller chunks, inviting more partners, trying to create more value from all of them, shaking up the set of partners to bring in more investors from Asia, more countries that were geopolitically important to the UAE, like Japan, Korea, China, to give those companies a direct stake in the upstream, and basically reduce the dependence on the Western majors. And we've seen that process play out over the course of several years. Another really important mentality shift is, trying to shake up ADNOC and make it a different type of company. The reality is ADNOC was a very sleepy NOC. It was not a dynamic place. There was not a whole lot of technical capacity. It was very dependent on foreign partners. Again, very conservative kind of company. And that system worked for a very long time. But the feeling was they needed to shake up ADNOC and expose it to new ideas, new partnerships, and new ways of doing business. And so Mohammed bin Zayed came in. Sultan Al Jaber was kind of his man appointed to shake up ADNOC and carry out this mission. And we've seen a really dramatic change take place in the oil sector. So everything that's happening today really has its roots in that period. We've seen that process play out over the last 5 years. And I know I'm going on a little bit about these changes, but I think it's really important to understand that for context for what's happening today. Since that time, we've seen all those major concessions, broken apart. New partners have been brought in. There's been a huge capacity expansion plan for the downstream sector, the petrochemical sector, the refining and trading. The Supreme Petroleum Council started to approve very ambitious growth production targets. Back in November of 2016, they approved a 5-year business plan to bring production from 3.5 to 4 million barrels a day. That has now been raised to 5 million barrels a day. That's the target for 2030. And everything is driving in that direction. So basically, the UAE has decided that they want to produce more now. They don't want to leave it in the ground for future generations. I think they have real doubts about whether or not we can count on robust oil demand for many decades to come. And this is the mentality. So it's really driven the UAE to this position where they don't want to just leave the oil on the ground and count on conserving it and conserving resource wealth for future generations. They're making big investments now and raising capacity. They brought in foreign partners and signed joint ventures to do it. And they're getting tired of production restraint. And what happened, over the weekend at the OPEC Plus meetings late last week and into Monday is a continuation of a stance that the UAE started to take last November. We're now at the stage where every time OPEC contemplates adding more volumes into the market, the UAE has to speak up and say, we don't want to do this and extend this agreement until we get ours. We want to produce more. And the time to do it is now. And that's why they've drawn a very hard line.
Thank you, Ben. That's a great sort of overview of the dynamics going on in the UAE and the way it's shaping this dispute. I think we'll come back to you in a bit and maybe drill down. But I want to, at this point, move on to Kate. Kate, I wonder if you could, now that we have that lay down from Ben about what's driving the UAE, could you just give us a sense, much more recently, what happened at the OPEC Plus virtual meetings last week, and maybe give us a bit in the thumbnail sketch of what were the dynamics leading up to that meeting over the past 15 months that got them to where they were with the meetings. And then we'll talk a little bit with you and Ben about the implications for the organization. But I'll let you start with that first question.
Thank you, Bill. I mean, it's I can't remember a time when things got so bad because, normally these matters would be resolved within the GCC before ministerial meetings, the formal closed door meetings began. They used to meet in the Saudi minister's suite. They would come up with a joint position, and then they would take it. Usually these things are cobbled together before the ministerial meetings begin. And what happened this time was that we were in crisis in 2020. The oil market was in free fall. Prices went below zero in the US, and they needed to have a deal very quickly. And just before that, if you remember, they had a price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and they were maximizing production. They flooded the market, prices fell. So they were in crisis mode. They had to cobble it together very quickly, and they came up with this agreement to cut production 9.7 million barrels a day, which was historically had never happened before. It was huge. It was like 10% of global supply, to stabilize the market. And they used a baseline of October 2018, to calculate the cuts, pro rata cuts, on the basis of not direct submissions of numbers by the member states, but secondary source estimates, which include, the price reporting agencies like Platts and Argus and so on. So that was the basis of it. And what's happened since is that, they've gradually eased, they've brought back some of these barrels. They've got about 5.76 million left after July. And there was agreement. I mean, I keep reading about the UAE blocking agreement to raise production. They didn't block agreement to raise production between August and December this year by a total of 2 million, monthly increments of 400. What they objected to was maintaining these same baselines, which I now say are unrealistic because they're some of them are fictitious. Russia, Saudi Arabia gave themselves 11 million barrels a day, even though they weren't producing that much at the time. So what the UAE said, okay, we agree to the increase in production, but we want the baseline to be revised to actually reflect our actual production in April 2020, which is when they were all maxing out their production. But what is interesting is that they're not speaking to each other. They are talking at each other through the media. What I understand, I mean, it's virtual meetings, so you don't get a feel of it. You can't actually talk to delegates, and they're very cautious because it's a very, very sensitive issue. These are two allies. You have cross investments. Mubadala is invested in Saudi Aramco pipelines. You've got Saudi Aramco, which has storage in Fujairah. So, that alliance was getting stronger. And so suddenly now you have this spat where they're not even speaking to each other. You would expect that if the ministers cannot resolve the issue, it would go higher, but it doesn't seem to be that way. Now, obviously, Kuwait could step in and mediate. Oman could step in and mediate, even though it's not a member of OPEC. It is part of the OPEC Plus alliance. So I think that's where we stand at the moment. You can't say the relationship has broken down irrevocably. I don't think the UAE can afford to walk away. But there's there are some moves that have been taken by Saudi Arabia that seem to be challenging the UAE and, making matters a bit more, escalating the situation. But one would expect that, UAE is a much smaller neighbor. I don't think they would want things to escalate much further. Saudi Arabia is big. It's the biggest economy in the region. They're both allies of the United States. Even the White House has gotten involved in this spat. So I think there is a chance, but as things stand at the moment, no further OPEC meetings planned. Nobody really talking about what's going on. Nobody's talking to each other. So I think it's we're in wait and see mode.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kate. I wonder, maybe for you and Ben, Ben, will whip it back to you first, and then I'll let Kate join in. Do you see what would be the possible areas of compromise on the energy side in this dispute? What is it? Saudi Arabia and Russia essentially revising up UAE's baseline of production, or is it something else? How would you, if they were going to make an energy-based compromise, what do you see that they would do?
One important thing to keep in mind is that there is consensus within OPEC Plus that we need more volumes. Everyone within the producers group sees that demand is increasing. They know the market is going to need more oil to be produced in the second half of this year. And we're at a time when prices have recovered quite a bit. They're still over $70 a barrel. this is a time when all the producing states want to take advantage of that. They want to produce more and take advantage of those higher prices, and they're pretty convinced that the market can accommodate that. So there is this agreement within the group that they all want to raise production. And the UAE, as Kate said, they've said explicitly, we don't disagree with the idea of raising production by 400,000 barrels a day from now until the end of the year. What we do disagree with is that we don't want to extend this deal without a more realistic reflection of our production capacity, our baseline. The UAE's baseline, or its reference production volume, is 3.168 million barrels a day. They say they're at 4.2 million barrels a day of capacity right now. And as I said, they want to go to 5 million barrels a day by 2030. And I think that it's quite realistic for them to do that based on all the capacity expansions they have. So I think that ultimately, OPEC is very good at cobbling together short-term deals and solutions. They do this all the time. We're in an unusual situation historically where OPEC talks every month. You know, they've kind of discovered the wonders of Zoom. They don't need to go to Vienna and sit in a room together for 2 days to do these things. They get together like us online and do it every month now. Mm-hmm. So there's tons of opportunities to talk. And the idea that we need to extend this deal until the end of December 2022 is something that so far Saudi Arabia has really stuck to. I listened to an interview with the energy minister, Abdulaziz bin Salman, this past weekend, and he said, the market needs this kind of certainty about the long term. You know, the reality, I think, is that no one knows what the market will look like in April of 2022. We certainly don't know what it will look like in December. And this idea of these extended OPEC agreements that go out for a period of 2 years is a new phenomenon. We really didn't have that until recently. So I suspect that if there's a deal to be struck, it's going to be about shortening that period and kicking the can down the road to renegotiate with the UAE about its production ceiling. And I suspect that we can strike some kind of deal like that in the coming weeks. I think everyone's hopeful that will happen. We have to keep in mind too that the worst case scenario is that there's no agreement starting August 1. I mean, as of right now, August 1 on is tabula rasa. We don't know what's going to happen. And the line from Saudi Arabia so far has been, we have an agreement in place. If we don't agree to extend it, as of August 1st, production stays flat for the rest of the year. And that is a bad outcome. You know, one scenario is that it causes prices to run up and overheat because the market is undersupplied. That's bad for OPEC. A worse scenario, and one that I personally think is more likely, is that if you don't have a production agreement and we're just supposed to keep it flat, you lose discipline and companies will just start producing at will to take advantage of higher prices. Saudi Arabia really does not want that because that erodes all the progress of the past couple of years, especially the past year, where they've brought on this massive oil cut since April of 2020. And they've been very successful at keeping those barrels offline and keeping the market disciplined. It's not in anyone's interest to lose that. So I'm personally still optimistic that they can strike a deal. I don't know when it will happen. I don't know if it'll be tomorrow, next week, or not until August when they meet again. Who knows? But you know, I'm fairly optimistic.
Kate,
may I say? Yeah, sorry, Ben.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the fact that they've made their positions known publicly makes it very difficult to back down. I mean, you know, when the Saudi minister was asked, Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, he was asked in this interview with Al Arabiya, he was, you know, why don't you separate the two issues? And he said, no. And he said it again in another interview. But, you know, when I heard the interview by Suhail Mazrouri, the UAE energy minister, who's been in his position, you know, in his role for a long time, he knows the workings of OPEC and OPEC Plus. And he said, you know, he expected the talks to resume on Monday before they were sort of abruptly called off and no new date set. So I think it makes it harder to sort of, you know, roll back if you've made your position so public, because they could have kept it quiet. You know, of course things leak. You know, there's always somebody who's willing to leak the information, and they were, you know, they've been briefings behind closed doors, off the record. But I find it really, really difficult that Saudi Arabia would back down. But they have. I mean, they have made compromises, and I think that's one of the things that really has irked the UAE, is that when the Russians objected to an agreement, they were given a small little increase, you know, to sort of keep them on board. And again, you know, it is a Saudi-Russian proposal. The statement made clear that this was the decision to end the talks, to cancel the meeting, was made in consultation between the ministers of Saudi Arabia and Russia. So basically they're saying, you know, we run the show. And I think that really rankles with the UAE, and particularly the leadership, which is becoming, Mohammed bin Zayed and Sultan Jaber, who feel that they are also a voice, a power to be reckoned with. They are US allies. They have they're diversifying. And again, you've got the diversification, the energy diversification. You've got peak oil demand on the horizon. So the UAE wants to increase production as opposed to increase production capacity in order to be, as Saudi Arabia has a policy of, being the central bank, keeping spare production capacity of 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day in the event of shortages when they can just step in. But that's gone now. The US is a big producer. Russia doesn't want to see higher prices. Prices as high as they are at the moment don't really benefit Russia because it's worried about the US taking market share. So I think there's a lot of dynamics, but ultimately this isn't just about oil. And I think Hussein will probably elaborate on that. This isn't just about oil policy. This goes beyond oil policy. There's been tensions bubbling beneath the surface. We see it in, in tweets from both sides. We see it in, subtle ways. It hasn't really come out in the open in official media yet. It's been very subdued, but you can sense that these tensions are now coming to the fore. And I think it's this whole oil policy dispute is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thank you, Kate. That's a good segue to bring Hussein in. Hussein, you're a very keen-sighted observer of the region. You've been doing this for many years. What is your sense of this dispute? What are the implications for the future relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
Okay, I think it's very easy to overstate the degree of rift here, but it's also easy to understate it, right? And I think you do get that from different commentators right now. There are people who are announcing the fundamental end of the Saudi-UAE partnership, and there are people, especially senior UAE figures on Twitter and elsewhere, saying that there's nothing here, this is completely normal, and there's nothing to see here, move along. And I think the answer is in between the two. It's been a very broadly held misunderstanding in the West and in a lot of the Arab world too, for a long time, that the UAE and Saudi Arabia were joined at the hip, that the UAE was sort of a protectorate of Saudi Arabia or a very, very junior partner in a partnership, and would simply, sort of consult Saudi Arabia on every move and didn't have much of its own independent worldview. And that was always false. I do think the UAE has been careful over the past couple of decades to contain any differences with Saudi Arabia for the reasons that Kate, alluded to. It's Saudi Arabia is a larger country, more powerful country. Ultimately, I think they need each other because they both provide capabilities the other doesn't have. The UAE needs Saudi Arabia more than Saudi Arabia needs the UAE, at least a little bit, in the same way that sort of Saudi Arabia needs the US more than the US needs Saudi Arabia. It's simply a larger and more powerful country. But there have been these differences all along. They do have distinct national interests. They have a different take on, for example, the interplay between religion and politics, which has led to different outlooks towards Islamist groups, like Al-Islah in Yemen, that Saudi Arabia made a cornerstone of its effort in Yemen, and the UAE basically wouldn't deal with it. Their attitude towards Turkey is very divergent. And because of these different outlooks on the region, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as the UAE has developed strength, and as we've entered into a period of diplomatic and economic maneuver in the region in general, I think it was inevitable that these differences would become more obvious. But at the same time, these are two status quo powers. They are both allies of the United States. They are both, they share the same basic threat perceptions. They both have three main concerns in the region: Iran and its network of militia proxies, the rise of Turkey. Although they see Turkey differently, they're both concerned about the rise of Turkey, and the continued menace of Salafist jihadist terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, stuff like that. Those are, for each of these countries, the main threats. And the solutions are very similar. And again, it comes down to aligning with each other, supporting the status quo under the generalized umbrella of the United States, even if American influence is fading. So ultimately, these countries are going to continue to cooperate very closely on most big picture issues. And I think that, so the bottom line is, real and significant differences, growing willingness to be open about those differences, but a partnership that's likely to endure at the fundamental level.
Hussein, if I could just follow up there,
Yeah.
do you see any, beyond the basic laydown that you provided, do you see any changes in the overall trajectory of their bilateral relationship that is contributing to this dispute that maybe isn't visible yet, or
Yes.
in terms of the actual oil dispute, but are there other dynamics that are going on, whether it's political economy competition, or Saudi Arabia's role as oil gatekeeper? Anything you want to elaborate on?
Yes, I think so. I think that the moment that we're in allows more space for countries like the UAE to become assertive, right? The moment of maneuver with all of these countries in the Middle East that try to project power in one way or another, seeking advantage through diplomacy and economic investment, soft and sticky power, if you like, rather than hard power, creates the opportunity for that. I do think that the UAE has a model of development which sort of encourages it to divest itself, to monetize its resources as quickly as possible, whereas countries like Saudi Arabia and even Russia are looking at energy resources as a long-term management of pricing and production, rather than let's monetize it and get out as quickly as possible. So there's a difference. There's also a different regional vision, but I think the UAE has become stronger in its view about its rhetoric of tolerance, of diversity, of building bridges, and sort of basing that on excluding religion in politics. Saudi Arabia can only go so far when it comes to that, because for the Saudis, religion is part of their legitimation narrative. And even if Saudi Arabia becomes populist and nationalist under MBS, it still roots a great deal of its national identity in Islamic history and Islam as a social and political text. And the UAE does not. The UAE, I think, also has a model of its own leadership in the Middle East. Its effort to kind of be a kind of, let's say, a vanguard of Arab politics, is not exercising regional leadership the way Saudi Arabia does, kind of in a very in a kind of assertive way at the multilateral level. But I think the UAE is seeking to set the agenda. And that is, again, leads the two countries into a kind of clash. So I think there are differences on political economy and development, differences on where they want to push political culture in the Arab world, right? An ideational difference. And then finally, there is a difference in not just national legitimation, but also leadership style. And all of these can and are creating tensions. But again, even though those tensions have increased and become more obvious, and there's plenty of space for more spats, I don't see the end of a partnership at a fundamental level, because they have too many ongoing compatible interests, too many shared goals when the rubber hits the road, and when it comes down to very basic stuff. Right now, we're in, as I say, a period in the Middle East of consolidation, retrenchment, and maneuver. So I think countries are looking to see how they can maneuver diplomatically and economically to gain advantage, as opposed to anything confrontational. When we return, as we will, to a dynamic driven by confrontations and by battlefield maneuvering, usually indirect, sometimes direct, I think you'll see the UAE and Saudi Arabia kind of forced by those exigencies to downplay their differences because it will become more risky. Right now, there's a kind of, it's not a risk-free environment, but it's a low-risk environment in the Middle East right now to air your differences because the threats are, generally speaking, not imminent and violent.
Thank you, Hussein. I've got one other follow-up question that I'm going to throw your way, but I'm going to circle back with it in a minute. I want to bring in an audience question that we have from one of our board members, David Welch. And this is for Kate and Ben to tackle. His question is, what does this mean, this dispute overall, for U.S. production? There are several angles of approach for that, but I'll leave it to you two to tackle it. Kate, you want to take a stab at it first?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to have that much impact because the operators in the United States are practicing capital discipline. They need to return cash to shareholders, and I think they're doing that. Of course, $70 plus oil helps them do that. I think, in fact, if we look at the latest EIA, the Energy Information Agency numbers, they actually expect production to decline slightly. It has gone up, but I think it'll probably be steady. I don't think it's going to be, this big surge that we saw between 2008, from 2008 onwards. So I think that's going to be pretty steady. It's just a question of whether sustained oil prices, high oil prices, will just encourage people to say, okay, we've returned some cash, we've maintained some capital discipline, and from next year we start producing again. And that's where OPEC came up with, when their analysts assessed the market for 2020, they saw a potential surplus emerging, and they've worked so hard to get the market into balance. So we've had 7 straight weeks of stocks declining, so they don't want stocks to start building again, and the market structure won't allow it anyway. So because if you withhold production, then obviously people are going, your prices, your forward prices, your immediate price is going to be higher than your forward price. And that doesn't really encourage people to hold stocks because you're holding a diminishing returns. So I don't think that's much of an issue. I think it is an issue for Russia. They would prefer to see prices coming down. So I've seen reports that Russia may be trying to mediate between the two at the moment. But I also wanted to mention the Abraham Accords. I mean, to go back to the geopolitics, is that something that has also weakened this alliance? Because, obviously Saudi Arabia isn't on board, has not normalized relations with Israel, but Bahrain has, and you would imagine that tiny Bahrain wouldn't have done so if they hadn't consulted at least with Riyadh. So I don't know if that's one of the reasons why you're having these sort of divergent foreign policy issues that may be causing friction.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
It's a symptom, not a cause. It doesn't exacerbate problems, but it demonstrates the divergence. I think Saudi Arabia has been very clear. It doesn't object to the Abraham Accords. That's been very evident in the public messaging. And you're right, Bahrain is effectively a protectorate of Saudi Arabia, and it wouldn't have acted. The UAE wouldn't have cared much what the Saudis said, but Bahrain would certainly have needed a green light, and obviously got it. So it's not a source of tension, but it certainly illustrates that there are different priorities at work here. And what it shows more than anything else is that the UAE has space to maneuver because of its relative smallness, and because it does not have the 3 things that Saudi Arabia does have, which are the large and brittle political system in Saudi Arabia with its very large population and diverse sort of range of political views. The UAE doesn't have that. Saudi Arabia has an Arab regional leadership role that it doesn't particularly want, but has to play because there's nobody else, and an Islamic global leadership role that it very much does want and fights for tooth and nail. None of that applies to the UAE. So the UAE has certain advantages of being a small and relatively isolated power over Saudi Arabia. It can do these things without caring much how others react. That's not true in Saudi Arabia.
Thanks, Hussein. Ben, I wanted to give you a chance if you had anything to add on the impact on U.S. production.
Sure. I think the general consensus is that $70 to $75 a barrel is kind of the sweet spot. It's good for everyone. It's good for producers. It's good for the OPEC states because it generates enough revenue to support their economies. It's not so high that it starts to destroy demand and affect economic growth in worry big consuming countries. It's good enough to make everyone happy. The problem is equilibrium never lasts. The phenomenon that we have, I think, in the last few years is that generally the price that is required to keep the shale sector healthy in the United States is more or less the same price that OPEC requires to keep most of their states in reasonable economic health. There are definitely exceptions, of course, but by and large, that's a good price for them. I think the worst case scenario and what energy investors are worried about is if we have a free-for-all and a price war in the second half of this year. That's what they're concerned about. Really, what has saved the US energy industry over the last year, honestly, is OPEC and OPEC's discipline. The fact that they made these massive cuts of 9.7 million barrels a day, and compliance has generally been around 100% or more every single month. You know, the US industry needs OPEC in a way that they don't like to acknowledge, but that's just a fact. Without that kind of production discipline, prices would have been much, much worse. These companies would have been worse off. And if OPEC falls apart and we don't have that kind of production discipline and it's every man for himself, it's a very dire scenario for prices and for the returns of these companies. So they don't want to see it. As Kate said, the watchword for these companies is capital discipline. It's been drilled into them for a long time now for investors to not spend 100% of their cash flow, but instead to be disciplined. Only reinvest a certain percentage of their cash flow, maybe 60, 70% at the most, and then use the rest to pay down debt and return it to shareholders. And finally, that message is sunk in. And the industry in the US is on course to have a great year, to have a lot of free cash flow for really the first time in about a decade. So investors are quite happy with that, and they want to see this track continue.
Thanks, Ben. We have two additional questions from the audience. Let me parcel them out. One, I think, probably goes in the first instance to Hussein. It has to do with the view from Qatar. The question, Hussein, is what are your thoughts about how this is viewed? This dispute is viewed from Qatar, given the so-called rapprochement post-rift.
I would imagine that the Qataris, I don't know, but I would imagine that the Qataris are, cautiously excited about this because it is very helpful to them in the sense that they feel, and it's probably true, that the UAE was a kind of an instigator of the boycott, of framing Qatar as a provocative and disruptive force in the Gulf, as disloyal to the GCC. And their dispute with Qatar is more fundamental. It's more ideological and ideational, has a lot to do with the fact that they occupy polar opposite positions on the question of political Islam, and especially the Muslim Brotherhood. The UAE casting the Brotherhood as the gateway drug and source of the problem of terrorism, Qatar casting it as the corrective, the alternative to violent Salafist jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Those are really incompatible ideas. Is it the fundamental problem or is it the fundamental solution? That's as far as you can get. I think Saudi Arabia found the boycott had reached diminishing returns, and under pressure from the United States, and because there was no point in continuing it, moved to end the boycott with Qatar. When the UAE was not really very receptive, they came within hours of a bilateral agreement. In fact, they announced that they were going to issue a bilateral agreement with Saudi Arabia ending the boycott with Qatar, but not the other states. The UAE intervened privately, and that was postponed until you did this broader GCC rapprochement at Al-Ula at the end of last year. Okay, what that means, though, is that the rapprochement between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is much more advanced than that between Qatar and the UAE, although UAE officials did express surprise at how far they were able to get in the bilateral conversations that they've been having with Qatar. I think they thought they would get less response, but it's not clear where they are. The bottom line is Qatar and the UAE still view each other with great suspicion, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia much less so. I think it's still the case that the underlying issues that led to the boycott and the rift are unresolved, but they're more stark and more dire between the UAE and Qatar than between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And under such circumstances, the Qataris may hope to find room to maneuver here. But again, I think that everyone who's looking at this as the end of the alliance or a real long-term break may be very disappointed because I don't think it is that yet. There's a lot of space for further deterioration, but in my view, neither country would benefit from a real rift, and I think they know that, which is why the rhetoric in public comments has been really cautious.
Thank you, Hussein. A question for Kate and Ben. This is from AGSIW board member Marcel Wahba. Given the basic difference of national goals on the question of oil production levels between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, do you think that Abu Dhabi would consider leaving OPEC? Kate, you want to jump that first?
Yeah, I mean, there have been reports that they've looked into the possibility of leaving OPEC, but I don't think, I mean, this is my personal opinion, I haven't spoken to anybody, I don't think that they are ready to make that break yet because it doesn't really serve their interests or the interests of the other producers. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, when you compare 4 million barrels capacity to 12 million barrels in Saudi Arabia, it's, you know, they are important. I can't imagine OPEC without the UAE, for example. Qatar was 500,000 barrels a day. UAE is, you know, 3.6, 3.7, 3.8. It can go to 4. So I don't think that will happen. But I just think what I find really baffling is that they refused that the Saudi proposal was, Saudi-Russian proposal, to extend this agreement to the end of next year became, you know, was non-negotiable. It was a package. It was, you agree to this, but you also have to agree to that. And I find that intransigence rather in sort of incomprehensible. You know, why? And Hussein, if you looked at Al Jazeera after the spat sort of became public, it basically confirms what you said. You know, they weren't dancing in the streets.
There was some gloating.
I mean, well, there was some gloating, but there was also more. You know, the tone was against the UAE as opposed to, you know, you could tell that. But yes, it's but again, you know, you've had a precedent. You've had and these date back to years and years and years ago, you know, the islands between the dispute. But I remember working for Reuters and being kicked out of their offices, their regional offices. They were kicked out of Bahrain because of some report over the island dispute with Qatar. You had the Dolphin pipeline between Qatar and the UAE nearly didn't happen because the last tranche of it was blocked by Saudi Arabia. So the neutral zone dispute between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, these were resolved. They were serious issues. But again, you know, you've had OPEC has survived the Iran-Iraq war, both members of OPEC. They've survived the invasion, you know, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. You had the Iranian sanctions. You've had, you know, there's been so much that has happened on the outside. If you looked at the last OPEC Plus meeting, Saudi Arabian Minister Abdulaziz bin Salman was effusive in thanking the departing Iranian minister Zanganeh, saying he was a friend, he would be a friend for life. I don't think they were friends, but I mean, they had a business relationship. And I think that's what happened in recent years. They used to go on for 2 weeks meetings. They would sit in hotel lobbies. No agreement would be made unless the minister called their leader and got permission. So I think it's become more businesslike. I think they will probably sort it out, but I think it's going to have to go beyond just a ministerial. And I don't think they're going to meet again until they can resolve this issue, because it's very damaging to the market.
Mm-hmm. Ben, anything you want to weigh in on with regard to prospects or possibilities that UAE might go to the point of leaving OPEC?
I think it's unlikely, but not impossible. The UAE has made this implicit threat that if OPEC membership doesn't align with its national interest, then they'll consider leaving. Mm-hmm. And they have drawn a really hard line. Mm-hmm. And as I said, this didn't just emerge this past week. You also saw it in November. And there's a process where sometimes ministers and delegations kind of use the media to float trial balloons. And at that point, you started to see the first inklings that there was a serious problem within the UAE about its reference production volume or its baseline. And it was something that needed to be addressed. Maybe it wasn't in that initial period in the first quarter of this year where they started to raise production, but it was going to get worse and worse. Mm-hmm. And so if they paper over this difference, but don't come to a fundamental agreement about the UAE's baseline, they can defer this problem, but they're not eliminating it. I really don't see the UAE backing down from this demand. And from their perspective, it's justified because they're really the only country within OPEC that has generated a lot of new capacity in the past 2 years, and that is on track to actually raise real incremental production capacity in the coming years. If they don't deal with the situation now, they're going to have to deal with it next year or the year after. So they are kind of in a unique position within OPEC. Most of these OPEC states produce flat out. They produce what they can. They really don't have spare capacity. The exceptions have always been the Arab Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, of course, unparalleled spare capacity. But the UAE and Kuwait were really critical partners in that regard. These are the countries that would idle production capacity when they had to. They'd go along with agreements. They were firm partners to Saudi Arabia. They were reliable, dependable partners within OPEC, and that makes them strategically important. So for OPEC to lose the UAE as a member, I think would be a big blow. It would be a big blow to the Saudi-UAE relationship. It would be a big blow to the organization, the loss of a very long-time credible member. If it's just a matter of increasing their reference production by 500,000 barrels a day, it's going to piss off some other members, but can't they deal with that? Mm-hmm. I mean, is it really worth not making this concession to the UAE and having them leave? I don't think so. I just want to underscore, from my perspective, this UAE threat is pretty serious, and they're going to stick to it. I don't see them backing off, and OPEC's going to have to find a way to deal with it and accommodate it. The last thing, if I could, just for 1 second, is that lingering in the background here is there is a resentment within OPEC at the fact that Saudi Arabia and Russia are coordinating so closely on oil matters. It's happened several times now that the Saudis and Russians have met before OPEC meetings, come to an agreement and presented it to the rest of the group almost as a fait accompli. And the other OPEC states don't appreciate that. They say, Russia's a Johnny-come-lately. They don't cut when they have to. They're not a reliable partner. They haven't complied with the terms of this deal. There is a resentment there. And I think this is a good example of another OPEC state sticking up for its national interests.
Yeah.
Hussein, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that from a political point of view, I agree it would be a very bold thing for the UAE to leave OPEC. It would cause a lot of problems and create a lot of anger. But the way I phrased it in the draft that is circulating internally now is that it's becoming imaginable that they could. I'm not saying it's select. I think it's unlikely. I think there are lots of reasons that would, political reasons, apart from the political economy, but just simply diplomatic and bilateral and multilateral issues that would hold them back. But I think it's imaginable.
Thanks, Hussein. Yep. Kate?
I was just going to add one thing. OPEC is getting ready to actually celebrate its 60th birthday anniversary. Was last year, but of course they couldn't celebrate it. So this year they're all going to Baghdad to mark the 60th anniversary. So that would be, quite a big blow. It's already difficult, I think, to imagine that that's going to happen in September, which isn't that long, but that's what they're planning on doing. I think, as Ben said, they have discussed internally the possibility of leaving OPEC, but it's hard to imagine that's going to happen. But again, it's the hardline positions from both sides. You make it public; it's very difficult to back down.
Well, I had a sort of a longer time frame in mind, not this year, but sort of over the next 10 years, where these conflicting imperatives become almost unmanageable. But yeah, I take the point. I would bet against it personally.
Ben, I have one follow-up question that goes back to your first laydown about UAE's energy policy and strategy for the future. Do you think that all of those aspirations that they and concrete partnerships and everything that they have done make any sense in a future where the UAE is not a member of OPEC?
What we're seeing is a produce now mentality, where the imperative is to raise production in the near term in order to raise revenue and use those funds to help further economic diversification efforts. Mm-hmm. It's really about bringing revenue forward to today. So in some sense, that does conflict with production restraint in OPEC. I think it's manageable, but there is kind of a natural conflict there.
Okay.
And we have to remember what makes the UAE kind of unique is that it's got a lot of joint ventures. It has a lot of foreign investors, unlike Saudi Arabia, where it's Aramco 100%. Anytime you cut production, your foreign investors get affected. And if you've got all these new deals that have just been signed, and companies are investing and raising production, it's hard to turn around and say, yeah, sorry guys, we have to cut production by 20% this month. And I don't know how long it's going to last. Okay. OPEC countries manage this, but it's kind of a messy process.
Thank you, Ben. A quick question, actually two questions for you, Hussein, from one from me and one from the audience, but they have to do with one. What do you see as prospects for any U.S. intervention in this dispute, and would such intervention be helpful? And then a completely unrelated question, but also in your bailiwick, is what might the impact of this dispute, this bilateral political dispute, have on prospects for a settlement in Yemen? This is from Mike Day, who works with Congressman Deutsch.
I don't think it's connected to Yemen in any meaningful way. The Yemen Wars is another symptom of the differing agendas and national interests that have divided the UAE and Saudi Arabia, even at the height of their joined at the hip partnership of 10, 6, 7, 8 years ago. It was always true that when they entered Yemen together, under the rubric of the UN Security Council resolution and to save the Hadi government and push the Houthi rebels back and all of that, they went in with different, with different imperatives, with different priorities. And the war in Yemen ended up splitting into two separate wars. A Saudi-led war against the Houthis in the north, and a war in the south, a balancing act in the south to manage the local southern forces, including secessionists and others, versus the Hadi government, and at the same time pursue a counterinsurgency against AQAP and elements of ISIS that are there, so a counterterrorism campaign, which is very different. I think it's also kind of the fact that when the UAE pulled out of Yemen, began a phased drawdown anyway, in July 2019, they were at great pains to kind of give the impression internationally that this was not a function of a disagreement or a difference with Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis kind of grudgingly went along with it, but obviously it was. There's no doubt about it. They had partially succeeded in the south to some extent. Their intervention was not by any means a total failure. It was by less means a total success. But for the Saudis, the whole enterprise in the north is a failure. It has basically lost, even as the Hadi government retakes swaths of territory in the north. Basically, the Houthis have more or less won overall. So in Yemen, I think this dispute doesn't do anything to change the Yemen. Now, as for U.S. intervention, I'd be surprised. One of the things that Biden has done to maintain Trumpian policies is that he has continued a form of economic nationalism in U.S. foreign policy. It's a bit different than Trump's America First. It's a lot less mercantile. It's a lot less transactional, but you still clearly have an economic nationalism, kind of America First 2.0, or a Biden version of America First in terms of the economic aspects of U.S. international relations and foreign policy under Biden. Under such circumstances, it's probably the same tripwire as we saw during the Saudi-Russia pricing war that Kate was referring to, where Trump intervened with the Saudis to stop the free fall of prices when it became a catastrophe for oil-producing companies and states in the United States, for the shale oil and other industries in the United States. And he kind of called the Saudis onto the carpet and quickly ended the dispute. So my guess is that there's enough continuity in U.S. economic nationalism and foreign policy that will similarly be the tripwire for Biden. If American oil-producing companies and regions start calling him up and saying there's a catastrophe, you need to intervene right away, I would imagine that might prompt an intervention. Short of that, I don't think this is going to be high on the agenda for the Biden administration. I could be wrong, but that's my guess.
Thank you, Hussein. We're going to wrap this up. I want to give each panelist 30 seconds to answer the following question. What do you think the prospects are for this dispute between the UAE and OPEC Plus being resolved in the next 3 months? Kate, you want to start? Just a quick sense of it.
I think before the end of the year, definitely. I think, demand is on the way up, but the market needs more oil, and I don't think it's in anyone's interests for oil prices to move higher. I mean, some of these financial wizards are saying it's going to go up to 80, it's going to go up to 100, and I don't think it's in anybody's interest. It will backfire on the oil producers because it will speed up transition to away from hydrocarbons. It will hurt consumer demand. So I think it is in their interest. But you know what? It's going to be OPEC and the non-OPEC alliance have to work together because OPEC alone can no longer control the market. Their share of it is much smaller than it was. So I think that whole alliance is one that they will want to preserve.
Thanks, Kate. Ben?
That was a terrific answer from Kate. I really don't have much else to add. And I wouldn't dispute any of that. I'm fairly optimistic. I think one possibility is that there's kind of this halfway solution or compromise that emerges. It could be in the next week or the next couple of weeks that doesn't really resolve the fundamental issue. In which case, there'll be an agreement that'll kind of settle the market and soothe nerves, but the core issue of the UAE's reference or its baseline gets pushed off to later in the year. In a sense, that wouldn't be a real solution. But yeah, I'm fairly optimistic.
Hussein?
Yeah, I mean, I'll defer to that in terms of political economy and the politics of OPEC and the national the economic strategies of these countries. From a political point of view, I think diminishing returns can be hit fairly soon. And so from that perspective, I would expect some kind of an agreement sooner rather than later, but a very temporary one, as Ben was saying, and also Kate. And my sense is that insofar as this dispute is linked to other differences between UAE and Saudi Arabia, they'll be manageable over time and they won't create endless crises. But I think in the end, there's going to be tension between the two countries over oil production and pricing for the foreseeable future, because they look at it very differently. The reason it would be managed is that this is only one aspect of the relationship, and most other aspects don't reveal the same fundamental dispute.
Thank you, Hussein. I want to thank our panelists, Ben Cahill, Kate Dourian, Hussein Ibish, for this wonderful presentation of the issues. Really a great discussion. Thank you very much. I want to say thanks to our guests who have contributed questions and who have listened in. I'm very happy that AGSIW was able to put together this panel on short notice. Thanks again to Raymond and his team for being able to do that. The video, as Raymond said, will be up on Monday. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you at our next event. Thank you.